From Uganda's Idi Amin proclaiming himself Lord of all beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas, to the lesser-known Jean Bedel Bokassa, who spent the equivalent of 1/4 of his government's annual budget crowning himself emperor of an invisible Central African empire. The stereotypical image of the African dictator has been one of an arrogant and cruel simpleton who manages to hold on to power through nothing more than brute force and populist rhetoric. But in the words of the renowned Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the problem with stereotypes is not necessarily that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. And when it comes to African dictators, there is probably no single greater illustration of the nuances and complexities that underpin dictatorships in Africa than Joseph Désiré Mobutu's 31-year stint as leader of the country known today as the Democratic Republic of Congo. A self-proclaimed anti-communist who modeled his entire state apparatus after China's Chairman Mao. A self-professing African revolutionary who collaborated with his country's former colonizers to depose his own prime minister. And a self-declared Afrocentric whose love for European luxuries and prestige would see him appropriate an estimated 1/3 of his country's GDP and build a personal net worth nearly twice the size of his country's national debt. A paradoxical man from a nation of paradox. Mobutu may have been stereotypically arrogant and cruel, but he was far from a simpleton. His over 3 decades as Congo's supreme leader would be built on a complex combination of evil genius, willpower, and good fortune. But to truly understand Mobutu, you need to understand Congo. And to understand Congo, we need to go all the way back to the very beginning. Born in 1930 to a poor family in what was then known as the Belgian Congo, Mobutu grew up in a country which prior to becoming a Belgian colony had been the personal property of the infamous Belgian King Leopold II, a devious monarch whose lust for wealth and power would see him appropriate a territory 80 times larger than his own kingdom and oversee the killing of over 10 million Africans within a period of just 2 decades. Responding to the international outcry following the discovery of King Leopold's atrocities, the Belgian government took charge of the territory in the year 1908. Through the promotion of the French language, the building of Catholic primary schools and seminaries, and most importantly, the transfer of all political power to the Belgian colonial administration, the Belgian government worked to create a society in which Belgian settlers would control Congo's vast mineral resources on behalf of the native population, who the Belgians expected to be submissive, cooperative, and reverent. The perfect colonial subject in Belgian eyes was a kind of African colloquially referred to as an évolué. This was essentially an African who, through formal education, Catholic teaching, and obedience to colonial laws, had grown to not just accept Belgian rule, but was perhaps even grateful for it. An évolué was an African with a good enough command of the French language to be useful but not threatening to the colonial administration. An African who tried his best to imitate the mannerisms and outward appearances of the Belgian settlers he saw around him. An African who, for all intents and purposes, had come to see Belgian culture as superior to his own. On his own personal journey to becoming a well-rounded évolué, a young Joseph Mobutu was studying at a Catholic boarding school in 1949 when his youthful mischief and boisterous sense of humor landed him in trouble with the priests at his school. As punishment for sneaking out and stowing away on a boat to meet a young girl, he was ordered to serve 7 years in the colonial army. And while he may have despised it at the time, Mobutu's 7 years in the colonial army would be perhaps the single most decisive period in the shaping of his destiny. During his time in the army, Mobutu received basic military training and developed a strong passion for reading and writing. Among some of his favorites were the writings of Francis Charles de Gaulle and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. But by far the strongest influence on the young Mobutu were the writings of the Italian Renaissance philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli. So strong was Machiavelli's influence on Mobutu that in the later years, one of Mobutu's military advisors would claim that Mobutu knew by heart most of the words to Machiavelli's seminal work, The Prince. Mobutu left the Belgian army a fully fledged évolué, and thanks to his strong command of the French language, he soon became one of only a handful of native Congolese journalists in the country. But the coming of age in the 1940s and 50s of the first generation of Congolese who, like Mobutu, had received enough formal education to hold white-collar jobs in the colony, would quickly begin to expose the flaws in the fundamental assumptions underpinning the Belgian colonial enterprise. You see, the Belgians assumed that the provision of primary schools, Western medicine, and consumer products would be enough to guarantee the emergence of a generation of natives who, unlike their ancestors, would be content with Belgian rule for the rest of their lives. But to their shock and horror, there was a glitch in the programming. Rather than simply be grateful for the so-called benefits of Belgian civilization, many within Congo's first generation of formally educated natives began to denounce the colonial system as hypocritical at best and deeply exploitative at worst. Under Belgian rule, natives had virtually no political voice and had no rights to own land or travel around the country as they pleased. Natives were also subjected to curfews in urban areas and forced labor in rural areas. Although they could attend primary schools, the only other form of further education available to most natives was either in Catholic seminaries or the colonial army. Only in the year 1950, nearly half a century into the colonial era, were native Congolese permitted to attend the same secondary schools as the children of Belgian settlers. While natives were encouraged to train as clerks, traders, miners, and mechanics, they could not become doctors, lawyers, or architects. In sharp contrast to British colonial policy, which generally relied on a level of joint enterprise between natives and the colonial administration, the Belgian approach was aimed at ensuring complete dependence on Belgian manpower and expertise. Virtually all posts in the civil service and judiciary were held by Belgians, and natives were not allowed to receive full military training or become commissioned officers in the colonial army. But despite Belgium's best efforts to keep its precious possession, the famous winds of change of the 1950s and 60s would ultimately deal a fatal blow to the house of cards that was the Belgian Congo. In March 1957, Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah successfully secured the independence of his home country from Great Britain. As the first black African leader to achieve independence, Nkrumah immediately embarked on an aggressive campaign to inspire young Africans from all over the continent. Nkrumah's message would resonate particularly strongly in Congo, where a multitude of political movements and parties would spring up in different parts of the country. Although most of these movements were divided along tribal lines and disagreed on fundamental issues such as whether Congo should be broken up along ethnic lines after independence, or even whether independence should be immediate or gradual, the one thing they all agreed on was that the Belgian colonial enterprise needed to be brought to an end. One of Kwame Nkrumah's most passionate Congolese disciples was Patrice Emery Lumumba, a passionate orator whose revolutionary zeal would see him become the most prominent leader in Congo's independence movement. Just like his hero Nkrumah, Lumumba was neither interested in a gradual transition into full independence nor a post-independence division of the country along ethnic lines. Shortly after attending Nkrumah's 1958 All-African People's Conference, his righteous indignation against Belgian imperialism became irrepressible, and despite facing strong opposition from some of his peers, Lumumba embarked on a campaign calling for the immediate and complete liberation of the Belgian Congo. But for all his revolutionary zeal, Lumumba would prove himself rather naive about the harsh realities of power politics and even the viability of the country he was fighting so hard to liberate. Very much unlike Nkrumah's Ghana, which had relatively high rates of formal education, a functioning native army, an experienced civil service, and a relatively homogeneous population, Lumumba's Congo was a very large and diverse nation with very low levels of formal education, and virtually all of the colony's entire civil service and judiciary was composed of Belgian nationals. To say that Congo was less prepared than Ghana for life as an independent Western-style democracy would be a bit of an understatement. As of the year 1960, Congo had a sum total of 30 university graduates, and the largest single group of formally trained native professionals, whereas less than 700 Catholic priests. Only 136 Congolese children graduated secondary school at the end of the 1960 academic year, and the country had no indigenous doctors, secondary school teachers, or senior army officers. But by far Congo's greatest disadvantage was the deep disunity among its various tribes and ethnicities, who for over 70 years had been united against their will by the strong and brutal arm of Belgian imperialism. And so very much unlike in countries like Ghana, Botswana, or Tanzania, there was no single independence movement or political party that had majority support from all or even most regions in the country. To complicate matters even more, Congo's rich mineral resources had made it a major geopolitical battleground in the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. In the eyes of the Americans, an independent Congo, led by the left-leaning Patrice Lumumba, was diametrically opposed to American interests, as it would open up the possibility of Congo's vast uranium, copper, and gold deposits falling into the hands of the Soviets. But while Lumumba's revolutionary fervor kept his head in the clouds, one man who had his feet firmly on the ground was the young Joseph Désiré Mobutu. Sensing that Congo's independence was virtually inevitable, Mobutu joined Lumumba's party, Le Mouvement National Congolais, which was popularly known as the MNC. Despite his many years working as a part-time paid informant for the colonial police, Mobutu rebranded himself as a passionate Congolese nationalist, and within a short while, he struck up a close friendship with Lumumba and even became his personal assistant. In his new position, Mobutu began working alongside Lumumba as he petitioned the Belgian government for his country's independence. The negotiations for Congo's independence were not cordial. Lumumba and his associates gave the Belgian government a 30-day ultimatum to either organize elections and grant Congo's independence or risk an outbreak of violence. Scared by the prospect of a full-blown Algerian-style war of independence, the Belgians were forced to hastily concede to Lumumba's demands. Shaken and embarrassed by how quickly they had lost control of their precious colony, the Belgians would now turn their energies towards ensuring an independence in name-only outcome, in which one of the more moderate pro-Belgium Congolese parties would win the elections and enable the Belgians to continue running the country as they did prior to independence. But despite their best efforts, moderate parties did very badly at the elections, and in fact, no single party was able to win a majority in the country's new parliament. However, following some rather swift and rocky negotiations, Congo eventually achieved its independence on the 30th of June 1960 after a shaky coalition of 12 different parties agreed to a power-sharing arrangement. Congo began life as an independent state with a 35-year-old Patrice Lumumba as its first prime minister, and Lumumba's arch-rival Joseph Kasavubu appointed as non-executive president. But like a young deer thrust into a den of hungry lions, Lumumba's Congo would be ripped apart before it could even find its feet.
Violence and chaos in the Congo. Barely 11 days after official independence from Belgium, Congolese troops mutiny and began a wave of attacks and looting throughout the far-flung sectors of the former colony. Meanwhile, in Belgium and in African countries bordering on the Congo, refugees are pouring in with harrowing tales of violence and of hasty flight. At least 10 Europeans were reported killed in a weekend of violence, with armed clashes in the key cities of Elizabethville, Stanleyville, and Luaburg, which was to be the new nation's capital. At the request of Congolese officials, Belgian paratroops were recalled to quell the native army's mutiny and reign of terror. A harsh awakening to reality from golden dreams of independence.
Within its first 7 days as an independent state, an army revolt would break out into a fully fledged civilian massacre as Lumumba's government struggled to control the situation. Sensing blood, opposition parties immediately began questioning the legitimacy of Lumumba's government, and a number of secessionist groups began threatening to rip the country apart. You see, Lumumba's MNC had actually only won 33 of the total 137 seats in the new Congolese parliament. Although this was the largest single total of any other political party, nearly half of all of the MNC's votes came from just one province in Stanleyville, and it had very limited support in the capital and other major regions. With the outbreak of chaos, Lumumba's rivals in the resource-rich Katanga and South Kasai regions spotted an opportunity to grab power for themselves and immediately began trying to secede from the newly independent Congo. Also looking to protect their own interests, Belgian operatives began collaborating with the Katangese rebels as they saw Katanga as a base from which they could eventually topple Lumumba's government and establish a pro-Belgium unified Congolese government in the country's capital of Leopoldville. By the end of its second week as an independent state, Congo was in a critical condition. Internal security had completely collapsed, the army was in disarray, the white minority of Belgian civil servants, doctors and teachers began fleeing to Belgium, and the rebels of Katanga and South Kasai continued threatening to break the country apart. In desperation, Lumumba dismissed all Belgian officers in the army and appointed his former personal aide Joseph Mobutu as Army Chief of Staff. Although Mobutu had only received basic military training during his 7 years in the colonial army, his ability to gain Lumumba's trust had just earned him his first major victory on the road to absolute power. As the crisis got from bad to worse, Lumumba publicly accused the Belgians of being at the heart of the crisis and appealed to the United Nations for help. Dissatisfied with the UN's response, Lumumba hastily turned to the Soviet Union for military assistance in his desperate attempt to restore internal order. And unfortunately for him, this move would ultimately prove to be his undoing. You see, Lumumba had long been on the CIA's watch list as a suspected communist sympathizer, and with his appointment as Congo's prime minister, Washington had been on high alert against the threat of increased Soviet influence in the Congo. And so with his appeal to the Soviet Union, the Americans felt that the suspicions about Lumumba had now been confirmed. Lumumba's actions would bring both Belgian and US interests into perfect alignment, and having agreed on the need to get rid of Lumumba, the only remaining question was about how to go about it. The perfect man for the job would be none other than Lumumba's newly appointed Army Chief of Staff. Where most people saw chaos, Mobutu saw a golden opportunity. The Congolese crisis would be for him the perfect way to fast-track his long-term political ambitions. By aligning himself to American and Belgian interests, Mobutu realized that he could use their military might to consolidate power for himself and create a perfectly symbiotic relationship between him and two of the world's most powerful countries. And so while Lumumba continued to accuse the Belgians of sabotage and desperately tried to rally up nationalist spirit, Mobutu publicly accused Lumumba of being a communist sympathizer and blamed him for the disorder in the Congolese army. acting in collaboration with President Kasavubu, the Belgians and the Americans. Mobutu would go on to arrange for the capture and secret execution of the very same man that had brought him to the corridors of power.
A new chapter begins in the dark and tragic history of the Congo with the return to Leopoldville of deposed Premier Lumumba, following his capture by crack commandos of strongman Colonel Mobutu. Taken to Mobutu's headquarters past a jeering, threatening crowd, Lumumba was impassive at this lowest ebb of his stormy career. Mobutu watched as his troops manhandled Lumumba, but promised the pro-red Lumumba a fair trial on charges of inciting the army to rebellion. Lumumba was removed to an army prison outside the capital as his supporters in Stanleyville seized control of Oriental province and threatened a return of disorder. Before that, Lumumba suffered more indignities, including being forced to eat a speech which he restated his claim to be the Congo's rightful premier. Even in bonds, Lumumba remains a dangerous prisoner, storm center of savage loyalties and equally savage opposition.
With Lumumba out of the picture, Mobutu turned its focus to forcefully crushing the Katangese and South Kasai rebellions, as well as a separate Lumumba-inspired rebellion that arose in Stanleyville shortly after his death. And after over 4 years of heavy fighting, Mobutu's US-backed forces successfully quelled all rebellions and restored power to the central government in Leopoldville. As a show of gratitude for his services to the nation, President Kasavubu promoted Mobutu to the rank of Major General, which in the year 1965 was the highest rank for an officer in the Congolese army. But by this point, Mobutu's deep connections and access to US and Belgian firepower had basically made him more powerful than both his president and his prime minister. Just 6 days after his appointment as Major General, Mobutu finally formalized his status as the most powerful man in Congo when he dismissed both the president and prime minister in a relatively straightforward military coup. Immediately moving to instill fear in the hearts of the public, Mobutu ordered the hanging of 4 of Kasavubu's former ministers in front of a crowd of over 50,000 spectators. With this bold and brutal spectacle, Mobutu sent a clear message to all his potential rivals.
Dans nos démocraties, nous ne pendons pas les politiciens, nous n'exécutons pas les politiciens.
Mais, je vous répète encore ici, mon cher ami, nous ne sommes pas des Européens, nous ne sommes pas des Occidentaux, nous sommes plutôt nous autres des Bantous. Et puis, ne croyez pas parce que nous avons été colonisés par les Occidentaux, que nous sommes devenus par là des Occidentaux. Nous restons Bantous et nous avons nos mœurs qui ne sont pas les vôtres, qui ne seront jamais les vôtres.
C'est dire que la démocratie, telle que nous l'entendons, n'est pas applicable telle qu'elle ici, à votre avis?
On peut l'appliquer, mais pas à la lettre, comme chez vous.
Quelle est la nuance exacte alors?
La nuance, c'est que chez nous, le respect dû à un chef, par exemple, c'est quelque chose de sacré. On ne peut pas jouer ou blaguer avec un chef. Lorsqu'un chef décide, il décide, un point, c'est tout. J'ai décidé au nom du haut commandement que nous sommes au pouvoir pour 5 ans. Et un point, c'est tout. Il n'appartenait plus à un groupe de politiciens d'aller se mettre du côté des financiers.
Like many of the world's greatest dictators, Mobutu understood that fear alone would not be enough to keep him in power. As part of Congo's 1966 Independence Day celebrations, Mobutu organized a massive memorial ceremony in honor of the deceased Patrice Lumumba. Standing on the grave of the man he had collaborated with foreign governments to assassinate, Mobutu recasted himself as a passionate African revolutionary and anti-imperialist. And from that day onwards, Mobutu's government would go on to execute one of the most comprehensive propaganda campaigns in modern African history. According to Mobutu, his decision to seize power from democratically elected politicians was not a power grab but a selfless revolutionary act to rid the Congo of self-serving politicians. His violent repression of cessationist politicians was not an assault on their right to self-determination, but a noble peacemaking effort to restore unity to Congo and protect it from foreign powers which were hell-bent on dividing the great nation. To his credit, Mobutu's masterful blend of hard and soft power initially yielded some very impressive results. Within the first 5 years of his regime, Mobutu managed to bring virtually all major regions in the deeply divided country into full submission to his government. On the economic front, Mobutu stabilized the country's currency, reduced the government's debts, and nationalized the country's lucrative copper mining industry. By the year 1970, Mobutu's Congo was seen as a genuinely viable state with the potential to become the single most important regional influence in Central Africa. Despite initially keeping their ties to Mobutu a secret back in the 60s, the US and other Western powers even began to publicly express their support and admiration for Mobutu. According to US President Richard Nixon, Mobutu was a leader of stability and vision. And in an official meeting between the two men in 1970, President Nixon would be quoted as saying, "Though you are a young man and you come from a young nation, there are things that we can learn from you." Mobutu's Congo was suddenly seen as an exciting destination for foreign investors, and encouraged by the US, Mobutu's government passed a number of laws which encouraged an influx of foreign investors and expatriates. Domestically, Mobutu's popularity hit an all-time high during the early 1970s as the soaring price of copper provided his government with a huge cash injection. With his newfound wealth, Mobutu launched a long list of grandiose development projects. From a steel mill near Leopoldville to a giant dam on the Congo River and a long-distance power line from Inga to Katanga. Despite his ties to the US and supposedly anti-communist stance, Mobutu would draw deep inspiration from China's Chairman Mao and more or less modeled his entire state structure after Mao's China. Marketing himself as a wise and benevolent father figure, Mobutu's stated grand vision was for the rapid industrialization of his country through his brand of state-controlled capitalism. Mobutu also turned Congo into a one-party state led by his own party, Le Mouvement Populaire de la Révolution, which was popularly known as the MPR. A one-party state was, according to Mobutu, the only way to ensure unity in such a diverse country. And in pursuit of this objective, MPR membership was made compulsory for all citizens, including their ancestors and even their unborn children. Drawing even more inspiration from Chairman Mao, Mobutu started his very own cultural revolution with the rollout of a state ideology which he called authenticité. Taking full advantage of the deep resentment of the Congolese people towards Belgian imperialism, Mobutu claimed that the ultimate goal of his new ideology was to re-Africanize the Congolese people through a complete rejection of European cultural norms and traditions. As part of his great African revolution, Mobutu changed the country's name to Zaire, and cities with European names like Leopoldville, Elizabethville, and Stanleyville were renamed Kinshasa, Lubumbashi, and Kisangani. The Congo River was also renamed Zaire, the country's currency was renamed Zaire, and the national anthem became known as the Zairoise. European names were completely banned for all Zairean citizens, and it became a criminal offense for any priest to baptize a child with a European name. Leading by example, Mobutu even changed his own name from Joseph Désiré Mobutu to Mobutu Sese Seko Kukungbendu Wazabanga, which in his native tongue meant the warrior who knows no defeat because of his endurance and inflexible will, and is all-powerful, leaving fire in his wake as he goes from conquest to conquest. From superstitious beliefs about the magical powers of his famous wooden cane, to elaborate songs and dances celebrating his divinity and omniscience, Mobutu will build one of the most remarkable cults of personality in modern history. Zaire's state-controlled daily news broadcasts would always begin with a short clip showing Mobutu in his iconic leopard skin hat descending through the clouds with hypnotic party jingles playing in the background. Places where Mobutu had worked and lived were designated as national pilgrimage sites, and MPR party conferences became nothing more than religious ceremonies in honor of Mobutu.
Nous chanterons et danserons. Nous chanterons et danserons. L'authenticité est notre philosophie politique. Nous voulons être nous-mêmes et non ce que les autres voudraient que nous soyons.
With all the fanfare and mindless adulation he received, Mobutu soon began to believe in his own myth. Taking full advantage of his unbridled power, Mobutu ordered the compulsory seizure of some 2,000 foreign-owned businesses operating in Zaire, which he claimed was part of a drive to Africanize Congo's economy. But rather than redistribute the wealth of Zaire to the Zairean people like he claimed, virtually all of these foreign-owned businesses were reallocated to Mobutu and his inner circle. Thanks to this and other similar policies, Mobutu would allegedly gain control over an estimated one-third of his country's GDP and build a personal net worth of over $5 billion. From an 800-hectare estate in Portugal, to office blocks and mansions in Belgium and France, as well as a huge $100 million palace built in his ancestral village of Gbadolite, Mobutu lived a life that other dictators could only dream of. Whether it was lavish parties with world dignitaries, or his private farms which were stocked with cows and goats delivered by plane from Switzerland and Venezuela. No desire was too opulent or too bizarre for Mobutu to indulge in. Following the death of his first wife Marie-Antoinette Mobutu, he married his longtime mistress Bobby Ladawa, and in typical Mobutu style, took his new wife's twin sister as his new mistress. But while Mobutu may have been a law unto himself in Zaire, the basic laws of economics were no respecter of person or position. Mobutu's seizure of foreign businesses operating in Zaire would prove to be an unabated disaster. Many of the appropriated companies quickly went bankrupt after being run to the ground and stripped of their assets by Mobutu's cronies. Adding fuel to the fire, the great copper boom that had provided Mobutu's government with huge windfalls suddenly came to an end. The cost of food imports rose sharply, the country's foreign debt began to rise exponentially, and the value of Zaire's currency was decimated as Mobutu's government tried to print its way out of trouble. Zaire's economic crisis would mark the beginning of the end for Mobutu's regime. With more and more citizens having nothing to lose, various opposition groups began demanding an end to Mobutu's one-party system. But despite Zaire's democratic deficit and deep economic crisis, Mobutu's government continued to receive firm support from the US and its allies. Through its close relationships with US Presidents Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush, Mobutu skillfully maintained the support of the US and other Western powers by promoting the idea that a regime change in Congo would plunge the country back into the chaos of the 60s and enable the Soviet Union to gain a foothold in Central Africa.
President Mobutu and I have had the opportunity to review and renew one of our oldest and most solid friendships in Africa, that between the United States and the Republic of Zaire. Cooperation between the United States and Zaire under President Mobutu's leadership stretches back through 20 years and 5 United States administrations. In that time, American leaders have learned to place a particularly high value on President Mobutu's insights and counsel. President Mobutu has brought a consistent voice of good sense and goodwill to the international councils where African issues are considered, from the United Nations to the Organization of African Unity to the non-aligned movement. He has stood uniformly for the peaceful settlements of disputes, but has not shrunk from his responsibilities when action was appropriate.
But while Mobutu's diplomatic prowess enabled him to keep his growing number of domestic enemies at bay throughout the 80s, the end of the Cold War at the start of the 1990s would mean that the old Mobutu or chaos argument no longer held as much weight with the US and its allies. After over 25 years of unyielding support, Mobutu's Western friends suddenly began calling for him to engage with the opposition and consider making Zaire a multi-party democracy. In an emotional address, Mobutu publicly announced that he would be stepping down as leader of the MPR, and he commissioned a national conference in which opposition groups would be allowed to speak freely in a public discussion about Zaire's political future. But to his shock and horror, the national conference descended into nothing more than a public denouncement of Mobutu's regime.
Monsieur Mobutu n'a jamais élaboré une pensée philosophique et cohérente à mesure de sous-tendre un système politique. Au mensonge s'ajouteront la pratique de la corruption matérielle et morale, le népotisme et le clientélisme politique et les multiples visages du chef de l'État lui-même, président fondateur, guide, timonier, père de la nation, maréchal, etc., etc.
Je demande à la Commission de présenter ses excuses pour cette dithyrambe qui est à la limite de la réconciliation. C'est trop fort.
As the conference continued, prominent opposition leaders began publicly denouncing Mobutu's regime in front of large crowds, and thousands took to the streets in public protest of the Mobutu regime. In response to the protests, Mobutu suspended the national conference and deployed troops to violently quash the demonstrations. But with the economy in tatters and most Zairians having nothing more to lose, Mobutu's violent crackdowns only led to more protests. But with the Cold War now ended, Mobutu's Western partners had no incentive to come to his aid, and so Mobutu was forced to flee the country's capital of Kinshasa to take up hiding in his presidential villa deep in the forests of Badolite. With Mobutu in hiding, the capital was plunged into total chaos with outbreaks of rioting and looting by angry mobs who sensed that the entire country was about to collapse. And just like his regime, Mobutu's body was also under siege. Right in the middle of all the political chaos, Mobutu was diagnosed with prostate cancer and had to travel to Switzerland for treatment. With Mobutu at his lowest point, an insurgency led by rebel leader Laurent Désiré Kabila, which was sponsored by Mobutu's longtime enemies Yoweri Museveni of Uganda and Rwanda's Paul Kagame, marched from the east to the west of Zaire to formally overthrow Mobutu's government. No longer propped up by his Western friends, Mobutu's army could hardly resist Kabila's insurgents. And after failed peace talks in May 1997, Mobutu was eventually overthrown by Kabila and forced to spend the rest of his life in exile. A sick and disheartened man, Mobutu died in Morocco a few months after his overthrow. But even in death, the system Mobutu created will live on for many years to come. Just like his predecessor, Laurent Désiré Kabila renamed the country, changed its flag and national anthem, and made grandiose promises of a glorious future. But in terms of actual substance, Kabila's rule did nothing to bring peace and prosperity to the Congolese people. And so even 2 decades after the end of both Mobutu and Kabila's regimes, the DRC remains one of the poorest and most unstable countries in the world, despite its infinitely valuable natural resources. From greedy and self-interested foreign powers, to passionate but naive ideologues, treacherous politicians, and a deeply divided people. The story of the DRC so far has been a melancholic intersection of flawed characters and unfortunate events. Will there be a positive twist in the tale in the years to come? Perhaps only time will tell. Once again, it's KB Tyro for New Africa. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this, then please like and share this video. And also consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/newafrica. Thanks again for all your support, and until next time.